Tom, Britain's economy, stagnant. The border's basically a fiction, right? We've got a new Prime Minister again. How's it all gone so wrong?
I feel that we are just becoming more and more of a joke of a country.
Is there an argument to say that Britain has become almost ungovernable at this point?
It's a moral horror show from front to back, and yet people can't seem to see it. Mass migration, illegal immigration. You put all of that together and you are creating a tinderbox atmosphere. I don't want to say what do you expect, but there is an element of this needs to be taken very, very seriously. It's almost like a recipe for social unrest, and that's what we've ended up with.
Do you think this could tip into something worse if Labour doesn't manage to get control of migration? Tom, Britain's economy, stagnant. The border's basically a fiction, right? We've got a new Prime Minister again. How's it all gone so wrong? Like, what is going on? What is going on?
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? I mean, the arrival of the mega dinghy the other day just made it feel that we are just becoming more and more of a joke of a country. Yeah, I mean, it's how did we get here? I mean, since Andy Burnham came to power, I think everything's just in a bit of a holding pattern, really. People are waiting to see if he'll do anything particularly different. But I think what's abundantly clear is that what we need is a quite radical break, not just with how the last Labour Prime Minister was running things, but how things have been running for quite some time. And it's clear that even if Andy Burnham wanted to do that, he kind of can't, certainly not until he seeks his own mandate. So I think everyone's just sort of, people often talk about the country being angry. At the moment, it feels quite resigned. You know, there's this sort of slow drift towards decline and potential economic or otherwise disaster, but there's no real sense that the people in power are going to do much about it, or that the alternatives are ready to take over either. So we're kind of stuck in this middle ground, I suppose, at the moment.
Endless holding pattern. Is there an argument to say that Britain has become almost ungovernable at this point, with all these quangos, regulations, checks and balances on the executive, parliament even? Yeah. Has Britain just got to a point where it's just like we're just in an alleyway now where we're backed into a corner and that's it, we're done? Is there an argument there?
Well, I think what your question points to is that it's clear that if someone wanted to come in and do what is necessary to sort out the economy, to get control of the borders, to bring the energy price down, whatever it might be, is that it's going to take more than simply being elected on that mandate, laying that legislation in front of Parliament, getting it passed into law, and then cracking on with things. There is this whole other layers that one has to now contend with, whether that's the legal architecture, human rights law, ECHR, refugee convention, what have you, whether that is the quangos, whether that is the other layers of the kind of unaccountable state, the civil service, the judiciary. All of these things would have to be sort of taken on almost in parallel. But at the same time, that is still a question of political will. It's something that ultimately, if you have a majority in Parliament is sovereign, it can do things, it can exercise power. I think what we've lacked, certainly from the previous Conservative administrations, was even when they did recognise what needed to be done, they lacked the will and the wherewithal to do it. So I think that's what we're sort of missing. Is it's clear that certainly on the right of British politics now, there is a diagnosis of what has gone wrong, a set of policies which is pretty much shared, but certainly between conservatism and reform in relation to migration, net zero, what have you. The thing they've got, any of them would have to marry that with is a clear plan for delivery, for clearing away this kind of thicket of nonsense which would get in the way of their agenda. So it's not to say that it's ungovernable, it's been made very difficult to govern, but that can change. Things can change quite quickly if people want them to.
It can, and like you say, there's a million ways of doing it, and like you say, whether there's political will to appear, because some of the stuff you'd need to do, you'd probably look bad in the headlines for about 24 hours, right? But are they willing to stomach that or not? Who knows? We talk about the quangos, talk about all the regulation, ECHR, etc. How much blame does Tony Blair shoulder for all this? He's
sort of gone down as the architect of all that ails us at the moment, and I think there's a fair amount of blame to be laid there. I mean, if you think about the issue of mass migration, I mean, he's the single most decisive political figure in opening the floodgates. I mean, if you think about the kinds of levels of net migration that the government is currently celebrating, because it's not nearly as high as the 1 million plus that we were used to.
It's only still, 250,000.
Yeah, it's only 250,000. Whereas, before the end of the 1990s, net migration was well under 100,000. I mean, and this is something that we'd become totally accustomed to. So since then, that kind of opening up of migration, the idea that it was going to be good for the economy, also that really insidious idea that he said in interviews, and it was also something which was reported on behind the scenes, of that it would be of sort of cultural benefit the famous quote about we need to rub the right's face in diversity, also interviews in which Blair would say things like Britain's future is this kind of cosmopolitan, kind of global meeting place. All of that is really laid the kind of foundation stones, not just for mass migration, but the kind of form of multiculturalism we've ended up with. What's interesting, though, I suppose, and also talking about the legal architecture, the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, even though that was again signed a little bit later, all of these things which have created all of these problems, which have sort of been the legal underpinnings to the issues with migration or identity politics, what have you, very much there. The censorship as well, crackdowns on speech is something that, even though we had laws that were very liberal on that front before, they proliferated under the new Labour years as well, whether that's incitement to religious hatred, whether that's the new communications offences that were brought in, etc. All that being said, it's quite interesting that even now you're starting to see Tony Blair kind of quite meekly say that things have gone awry in some of these areas, which one could be infuriated by. But also it's kind of interesting that that this is... it takes him to point out, at least from any figure who's at least considered to be on the centre-left of British politics, to realise whether it was the gender issue, whether it's some of the things he said about net zero more recently, even the pretty firm, for him, line he seems to take on illegal migration, although that was actually kind of part of the new Labour years to a certain extent where illegal migration was concerned. But nevertheless, he's kind of scandalising even his own sort of political descendants when he comes out and says these things. So we do live in Tony Blair's world, but it's a world that's gotten so wacky that only Tony Blair is allowed on the left to point this out. So it's insult upon injury all the time, I suppose.
Yes. You mentioned earlier, obviously, if you want to get stuff done, the state's got to have political will and the drive and the agenda to get stuff done. Is the state doing too much or too little on that point? Because obviously there's some who would argue, well, actually, it's not on the state to do all this stuff. Actually, just leave it all to the private sector. And some would say, oh, actually, the state has got to do everything. It might sound strange, but it seems to me like it needs a bit of both, really. Where would you stand on that?
Well, I think one of the big problems is that the state is doing far too much of things that it shouldn't do and too little of things that it really should do. It's spending far too much on things which are actually quite malign in their effects and spending far too little on the things which are the basic foundations of a civilised, prosperous and secure society. So the classic example, I suppose, at the moment in terms of contemporary Westminster debates is the amount being spent on welfare compared to the amount being spent on defence. I mean, the welfare balloon has enlarged so much that I don't think anyone can credibly say that it's actually of a net benefit to the welfare of many of the people on it anymore. It's become a trap for the worried well or for people who are struggling to break into the job market and have decided that the issue is anxiety and depression rather than a lack of availability of jobs. It's also become a way in a lot of parts of the country in which there isn't as much opportunity to just quietly shuffle people from the unemployment column into the disability column. You'll notice that there's a remarkable confluence of people in parts of the country which have never really kind of economically recovered from deindustrialization and whatnot, with the rise of mental ill health and whatever. And you could say, of course, they're deprived areas, they're more depressed areas, people are going to be more deprived and depressed, but clearly there's something in that as well. Meanwhile, we live in a pretty dicey kind of geopolitical environment at the moment in which talk of World War III is back constantly, even though it can be a little bit over-egged. It does show that this idea that we were just going to have never-ending peace, at the end of the has been called into question. And yet it's such a kind of Herculean effort, it seems like, to get anywhere near 3%, let alone 3.5% spending on defence. So I think that's one of the things. The state is really obsessed with projects which certainly aren't delivering on what they're supposed to deliver on. It's also obsessed with kind of almost micromanaging people's lives to a degree that is totally authoritarian, whether that's speech, whether that's lifestyle, what have you. Meanwhile, the things that it should do, the things that it should spend money on, the things that it should concern itself with, it's got absolutely, it's either not doing it or it's just completely kind of retreated the field, I suppose.
Controlling the borders, defending the nation. And I think we touched on net zero, what's it, powering homes, right? What do people want? They want food in their bellies, they want heating, they want electricity, and they want it all for like a reasonable-ish price, something affordable. Net zero seems to have just put paid to all that, it would seem to me. I was actually just in Norway, right? They've got a lot going for them.
Yeah.
They're very tall, like you.
Sounds
They
great.
all seem, I wouldn't say happy, but they're fine, right? It's the weather over there is miserable.
Yeah.
But, beautiful landscape, etc., etc. They've also got incredible functioning economy and society. Everywhere is spotless. Public services are fantastic. And in no small part, because they will actually drill the North Sea oil they have access to, funnel it into a sovereign wealth fund, and power the economy, right? And they're all just living this life of largesse over there. It was amazing to see it, this society of high trust, high wealth. How much is net zero holding back Britain at the minute?
So here's a fact for you. Every bit of gold ever mined, all of it throughout history, would fit into a cube about the size of 4 tennis courts. People have treasured it for 5,000 years, and there's a reason it still turns heads. And owning some yourself? Well, it's easier than you'd think. The Pure Gold Company, voted the UK's best gold broker and recently ranked 55th in the Sunday Times' fastest growing private companies, specialises in physical gold from the raw mint. At the Pure Gold Company, you get one-to-one expert guidance from a real human at your pace, whether it's your first coin or your 50th. Then it's delivered discreetly to your door or stored in a secure professional vault. It's your choice. You can download their comprehensive guide to buying gold by visiting their website. See the link in the description. Oh, and by the way, tell them JJ sent you.
I think it's you can't really overstate it. Partly because it's one of the kind of fundamentals of modern developed societies that if you want a level of wealth, if you want a level of prosperity, what you need is abundant and cheap energy. This is something that we used to take for given, and yet at some point along the line, we got it into our heads that again another goal was more important, i.e., saving the planet. Even though the idea that poor Britain, and it's less than 1% of global emissions, would make any dent in that, or that our supposed global leadership on this front would convince Xi Jinping that actually, you know what, I've been looking at what this Ed Miliband has been saying, and I think we need to change track. It's absurd, and we've impoverished ourselves as a consequence. It's obviously not only is it felt on a kind of day-to-day cost of living sense, the bills going up, what have you, but also the inability of business to operate. Everything from hospitality through to, more larger corporations and companies. Cheap and abundant energy is absolutely essential to them being able to operate. Some of the technologies of the future, there's obviously a lot of controversy over AI, questions about whether it is going to be the great revolution, whether it's going to be the end of humanity, whatever, all of that. But at the same time, you need tremendous amounts of cheap energy if you're going to be any sort of player in all of this. I mean, I don't think we'd ever compete with the US or China on that front, but to be in the mix, you need to be able to have the sufficient power to, link it up to those data centers and all the rest of it. It's just from top to bottom, it's absolutely essential. And this is something people used to know, even, in the Labour Party, they used to talk about, we should aspire to a situation where energy is too cheap to meter. And yet that's gone by the wayside. And I think at least now it's become a question that is genuinely politically contested. Up until about 5 minutes ago, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats were all singing from the same hymn sheet. When the Climate Change Act was passed in the sort of dying days of the New Labour years, that was something that was done with cross-party consent, if I can remember right. I mean, it was even the Tories would try and say it didn't go far enough in certain areas. Net zero was Theresa May's baby. It was when she was again kind of thrashing around looking for a legacy that wasn't stuffing up Brexit, and waved this crazy target in without even a vote, if I remember correctly.
2030, wasn't it?
And it was just backslapping debate. It was like, aren't we wonderful?
Oh, yeah.
And so, but now the whole picture has changed. It's basically become a left-right issue, which I think is unfortunate, because I think there's no reason why any self-respecting left-wingers should think that impoverishing a country is a good idea.
Maybe a glimmer of hope for you then, Tom. I've heard from people inside the Labour Party, Whitehall, that net zero is turning into a massive political football within the Labour Party, right? You have these people on the proper mental left, sort of, Miliband, etc., who are like, no, Britain will save the planet single-handedly, never mind what India and China are doing with all that coal. Don't look over there. We're going to save the planet with net zero. Build a bunch of wind farms and let's see if we can power a couple of houses. Then you've got people like Johnny Reynolds, this new guy back in at business department. You've got people like the Chancellor, Burnham himself, I understand, who are like, no, if we're going to have any sort of industrial strategy of any kind, if we're going to manufacture anything outside of London, well, guess what? You need cheap power. So maybe, Tom, there's a glimmer of hope there.
Trade unions as well have been furious about a lot of this for some time, particularly jobs in the North Sea. Some pretty punchy comments from union leaders about saying we're going to end up with another Thatcher moment, with the closing of the pits. You're going to have the same thing with what remains of our oil and gas industry. And that I suppose points to this thing that is fascinating about the left's embrace of environmentalism, is that, you've got people, Andy Burnham is oddly nostalgic about the kind of pre-Thatcher era. He talks about it a lot, but it's almost like he wants the 1970s without the coal, like he hasn't quite made the connection. That those things, and Labour is basically one of people going around saying that the few remaining fossil fuel assets that we have should be closed down, that those jobs should go elsewhere. I mean, the problem is they always try to claim that you can have your cake and eat it, that it will just deliver these plentiful green jobs, which never actually materialise. But it is fascinating that the left have become so obsessed with environmentalism, because what it means is working class people's lives getting more expensive, more difficult, and there are fewer high-skilled jobs for them to do. That's essentially what it has meant in practice, and yet they've wedded themselves to this campaign. But hopefully, as you say, cracks are beginning to show there.
Fingers crossed, Dave. Fingers crossed. Right, before we move on, one final question on this strand for you. If you're in charge, say you're running the country for some reason, right, what would you change?
That's such a good question. I think we've sort of already talked about it, but it's so clear that the three key issues that are really infuriating people, like I could talk about my pet issues and things that really preoccupy me, but you've got to get control of the borders. Yeah. You need to get the economy running again, and you need to scrap net zero, and those things, at least two of them, are somewhat interlinked. I really think anyone going before the country with a clear plan in which to do that, with convincing arguments, could dominate politics for about 10 years quite easily. And yet it's something that only now are becoming some of the key issues. But, especially with that kind of mega dinghy in everyone's minds as a course of this week, I mean, just the kind of daily insult that is to the sovereignty of this country and to people's intelligence, being told that actually the problem is getting better, even though we can still see that it's very much still an issue. Again, I think the future belongs to someone who can not only say we're going to get on top of this, but here's a credible, deliverable plan for doing so. Yeah. I think that is the secret to actually, even though we live in a very fractious political era, people are voting, floating votes and whatever, there's a very strong coalition for all of those things, I would say.
Well, let's see if that person comes along. Well, fingers crossed, eh? If you're enjoying this episode, again, hit like, share, subscribe. Don't forget to smash the hype button. And thank you once more to the Pure Gold Company for sponsoring this episode. Check the link in the description below to find out a bit more. Right, Tom, we were talking about migration. Andy Burnham's put his foot in it already. He's managed the seemingly impossible. He's even on holiday and he's managed to do it. You wrote a piece saying he's refusing to listen to people on migration. What mistakes has he made now?
Well, I think his fundamental mistake was not to take this issue particularly seriously. Andy Burnham is a kind of comfort zone politician. He likes talking about Manchester. He likes talking about devolution. Oasis. He likes the kind of general sort of soft left talking points, I suppose, economically speaking. But when it comes to migration, which let's not forget, depending on which poll, at which time of year, how many mega diggings have landed that week, is either the first or second issue on voters' minds, at any one point. He doesn't really have much to say about it. That's not to say that he is some kind of quiet, open borders zealot necessarily, but it makes him feel uncomfortable. He doesn't really like discussing it. And he came a cropper this week because he was asked in an interview with GB News about the issue of migration, about the issue of illegal migration. And his response was to pivot to, it's really unfair that poorer communities have had to bear the brunt of this and that more affluent areas need to, in his words, do their part. Now, the thing about this is, on one level, he is right. If you look at the areas which have had to bear the brunt of the small boats crisis, it's disproportionately some of, not just poor areas, but some of the most impoverished areas in the country. I mean, The Guardian did a good analysis on this back in 2021, I think, which found that it came down to about 20 local authorities who had a disproportionate number of illegal migrants housed there. Something like 9 out of 10 of them were some of the most impoverished in the country. This is a really stark issue. And the reasons for it is because of the fact that the accommodation there was cheaper, the hotel rooms were cheaper, the rents in the HMOs were cheaper. And that adds to the sense of injustice. Also, incidentally, if you looked at some of the hotspots for the horrific post-Southport riots, it basically maps onto many of the places which had the largest numbers of Home Office-supported asylum seekers and illegal migrants. So the sense in which this is actually feeding not just anger but unrest is impossible to ignore at this point. And Andy Burnham, at least to his semi-credit, clocked this quite a while ago. At one point when he was mayor of Greater Manchester, he said to, must have been Sajid Javid at the time, that he was threatening to refuse to take any more illegal migrants because of just how many Greater Manchester, but the North West in general, were taking at that particular point. But the problem is it's this kind of literal mindedness. It's like I talk to voters and they're upset that even though these are areas that don't want illegal migration, that probably have voted against parties who want to be literal migration for some time, they're having to deal with the consequences of elite virtue signalling in the Labour Party or Hampstead or whatever. That's not really the problem. The fair distribution of illegal migrants is not the issue with illegal migration. The issue is that they're here
too many
to begin with. And how do you get on top of that? How do you close the border? How do you detain and deport people? How do you make sure that it doesn't just become a funnel for illegal migration under the banner of asylum? And this is a bit of a problem with the Labour Party in general, is that they have this really kind of almost adorable literal mindedness when it comes to this issue. So people are protesting outside of migrant hotels and they're like, oh, you don't like the hotels? We'll shut them down then.
It's fine, but we'll put them in flats next door to you instead.
Exactly. How about that? And then like, oh, you don't like the HMOs? Well, we'll put them on a military base then. Don't you worry about that. What's funny about the military bases, though, is that this is causing revolt even in kind of leafy, affluent areas of the country now. There was that village Piddington in Oxfordshire who are threatening to declare independence from the UK because I think it's the nearby Bicester garrison is due to have 1,200 male migrants delivered to it, which would dwarf the population of Piddington by almost 4 times. So to plague, on the one hand, illegal migration is a class issue for the reason that we've talked about. On the other, it won't remain one for very long if it continues to be dispersed across the country.
I was going to say on that point, it is interesting what it says about moving these sort of migrants to middle class areas. I'm just imagining these sort of Lib Dems in Cornwall coming up against someone for the first time, being like, oh, actually, shit.
The penny might drop.
Everything I previously thought is wrong.
And so the Lib Dems are very good at NIMBYism as well.
Yes.
So,
yes, exactly. Yeah. Perfect storm. How is that going to change the political outlook of the country? It kind of feels almost like, in a way, it could, if you're sort of reform-minded, accelerationist argument, right? It could almost get the rest of the population who think this is all still fine to change their mind, maybe. What do you think?
It could well shift the dial. I mean, one thing that I would say is that there is, for instance, a lot of asylum seekers / illegal migrants, pick your term of choice, in a place like London. This is not purely seaside towns on the coast or places in the north which have had to bear the brunt of the small boats crisis. And yet even people in those areas will have probably seen the consequences of this, will have seen the issues that this is posing for crime or social cohesion or what have you, have noticed certain areas getting a little bit more scratchy in the evenings than they were previously. And yet I think the problem is that particularly the kind of great and good, people work in the kind of media classes, they've sort of trained themselves out of common sense. They've sufficiently imbibed this sort of open borders ideology that they can ignore the evidence of their own eyes. So I think it's fair to say that because many people across the country who are in the wealthier postcodes have been insulated from the consequences of illegal migration, are therefore more amenable to the argument that at the very least it's been exaggerated. There's a problem that needs to be taken care of. I think many of those people will, when confronted with the consequences of all of this, probably change their mind. But there is a certain layer who I think just can't see it because they've just got the blinkers on, especially in places like London, which have been, as I say, hit by this problem, but they choose not to see it. Speaking
of people with the blinkers on, NGOs, these groups like Care for Calais, how much blame do you think they have to saddle for this migration crisis? Because obviously we talk a lot about the government and what they are and aren't doing, and that is obviously the central crux of the issue. Yeah. But these NGOs as well. I mean, one of our reporters was in Calais last week, I believe, and he was out with Lee Anderson, and they found a leaflet handed out by one of these NGOs telling people exactly how to get to Britain on these like people smugglers, small boat dinghies. It's crazy. How much blame do you think these NGOs have to saddle for this?
I think an awful lot of the blame. I think there's also got to be some questions asked as to why they weren't held to account to begin with. Do we really think it's a legitimate charitable purpose to facilitate illegal migration into the country, or to encourage it, shall we say, or to produce leaflets if that indeed is theirs? I'm sure you've spoken to them. How is that a legitimate charitable enterprise? I mean, so therefore the role that they played needs to be also, not only should they be condemned for it, shall we say, but also there's got to be political consequences to that. And I find it particularly despicable because of the fact that I know many of these people will be kind of open borders ideologues. Like they would probably prefer that the Home Office was chartering flights to take people from Calais over to the UK, that we would have no border whatsoever in effect. But at the same time, by continuing to, I don't know, almost support the status quo, if you like, to, if anything, provide succour and support to those looking to avail themselves of people smugglers to get into the country, the knock-on effects of that, the human cost of that is tremendous. Not only in terms of the countries into which illegal migrants arrive, where of course people, even if they're on one of those boats, many of them are just looking for a better life. Many of them are fleeing crimes and convictions in other countries. Many of them are going to be there for broadly speaking, fair enough reasons. Others are going to be there because they actually intend to do harm, and they might have been denied asylum in various different places in Europe who cottoned on to what they were like. You can't tell the difference if they're all entering the country illegally, is the point.
On that point, we had one superb investigative editor, Zach Garner-Perkis, went undercover in Calais, Dunkirk, I believe, and found one of these guys who was like basically openly admitting not openly admitting, but sort of secretly recorded, admitting that he'd been chucked out of Denmark and another European country, and that he was coming to the UK to, quote, stab, shoot, join gang. And you're like, okay, like you say, in amongst all these very like people who are fleeing conflict, who are here or trying to come here for the right reasons, you have people like that.
Yeah, and of course, no one should, even if they don't intend to inflict harm on the society, you can't allow illegal migration, and that has to be done through the right routes. But this is the thing that people are completely blind to. But also considering the fact that if you essentially allow and incentivize people to enter the country illegally, you're going to attract some deeply unsavory characters. Also think about what that inflicts on the people they meet along the way. I mean, some of the reports from Ceuta, the Spanish exclave that was invaded by 50,000 migrants, primarily from Morocco, although they weren't all from Morocco. I mean, the stories on the ground there was horrific. You had young girls who were, again, part of the migrant bloc, shall we say, who were presenting themselves to journalists and police saying they'd been sexually assaulted by other migrants. Because when you have this lawlessness, you have smuggling gangs, you have drugs, you have terrorism, you have sexual exploitation. All of these things go together, and that lawlessness is being allowed to continue by these virtue signalling charities who, if anything, are providing assistance to this whole situation. So from top to bottom, whether you're worried about the welfare of British citizens or you're worrying about the welfare of people caught up in this, it's a moral horror show from front to back, and yet people can't seem to see it.
Completely agree. And I think also there's a big question around, it sounds a bit lefty, so do bear with me, the level to which corporations also have to saddle some of the blame for what we're seeing in the UK now. I read a story that apparently Vodafone was issuing SIM cards to groups like Care for Calais to essentially give to these people trying to cross into the UK illegally. I also remember, this was during the Brexit debates, Pret, I believe, were whinging that the price of their sandwiches would absolutely have to go up if we left the EU because they'd have to pay people a bit more. Yeah. and you're like, do you hear yourselves? Yeah. Like, I think there's a good left-wing argument there to sort of say, well, actually, a lot of the problem with migration, especially the high numbers of legal migration we've seen, is actually coming from pressure from corporations who are like, do you know what? These really annoying British people are asking for £15 an hour. Yeah. But so-and-so from Romania is going to want 10. Yeah. So what you need to do, Andy Burnham, Keir Starmer, Liz Truss, Rachel Reeves, etc., is import a load of people who will work for £10 an hour so we don't have to increase our wages. How much do you think corporations are to blame for what we're seeing? Oh, a tremendous amount of the blame lies there. They've been allowed to get hooked on cheap imported labour. I mean, that is true in so many different areas, which is not only a block to raising the wages of people who are already in Britain, but also to investment, to automation. Do you really need people to be coming over, even just like seasonally from other parts of the world, to pick strawberries when really a machine should be doing that at this point? There's all these questions that need to be asked there. There's also companies which they would claim it was an unfortunate accident, but have allowed themselves to be hooked on illegal labour as well. If you think about some of the delivery apps, naming no names, if you think about some of the... Oh, I'll name them. So we exposed it. We went to one of our first big stories actually on YouTube. Again, Zach, our amazing investigation editor, was outside this migrant hotel in London where these guys were literally rocking up outside this hotel on these bikes with branded delivery bags and Just Eat, right under the noses of people who are supposed to be keeping an eye on them. Just to be clear, the legislation dictates it. You can't be doing
Can't
work
work.
like that.
Yeah,
you can do certain types of work that may be desperately needed, but that is not one of those types of work. So yeah, like you say, it's interesting, isn't it? The level to which these corporations, especially these delivery companies, have been.
Yeah. And that started to be called into question. But your point about why this has become a left-wing position, which is basically be in favour of cheap imported labour or even deeply exploitative illegal labour, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. The idea that the left were always historically like open borders is not really borne out by the evidence. I mean, this is something that, as far as I can tell, you kind of start to see really picking up in the kind of 1970s, when there's a sort of more sort of third worldist tendency on the left, beginning to see migration and as almost like a part of a sort of reckoning with the sins of colonialism. You see those sorts of arguments start to emerge. But, even the kind of more sensible sections of the trade union left that still exists have been very migration skeptical for a long time, because they know that it really suits the interests of, as they would put it, the sort of boss class, rather than the interests of the working class in this country. So it's another interesting area in which you see supposedly progressive cultural politics aligning perfectly with the red and tooth and claw interests of the capitalist class. But it's not the only example, but certainly the most egregious, maybe.
It is very egregious. Look, before we wrap up, you touched on it earlier. We've seen riots recently, the last few years, especially since 2024. Do you think this could tip into something worse if Labour doesn't manage to get control of migration?
I mean, that's always the concern. I mean, you don't want to make it sound like that one should be looking towards this with any, to be flip about it or relish, because that was one thing which, excuse me, that was one thing that one always needs to be careful. People are almost like talking themselves up into the idea that there's going to be civil war, the idea that there's going to be deep unrest, and that would be vindication to all of those who have said for many years that immigration's out of control, that multiculturalism is a horror show, that we need to get on top of these issues. Not saying that at all, but at the same time, if you look at the way in which successive governments have dealt with the combined issues of mass migration, illegal immigration, multiculturalism, it's almost like a recipe for social unrest. The way in which, as Andy Burnham reminded us this week, the poorest communities in the country, in which opportunity and public services are really stretched, have suddenly found hundreds, in some cases thousands, of people who have no right to be here emerging in their midst. The way in which, when there are crimes which are committed by people who have no reason to be in the country, or even if they did come here legally, there has been no effort whatsoever to integrate them. When those are reported by the police, they are covered up, like the grooming gangs, because they are worried about what it might do to race relations. If you think about the way in which, up until very recently, even raising a word of protest about these issues, certainly in mainstream politics, was want to have you hounded out as some sort of racist, xenophobe, neo-fascist. You put all of that together and you are creating a tinderbox atmosphere. If you have a situation in which the public at successive elections vote to bring migration down, and successive governments let it soar to unprecedented sky-high levels, and then, as I say, when they try and say anything about it, they're either smeared or censored, you're depriving them of all of the usual ways in which they would be given to change the course of the country, or even just have their say. So I don't want to say, what do you expect? But there is an element, this needs to be taken very, very seriously, because the neglect of this issue, the political fraud that certainly the Conservative Party committed by saying one thing and doing another on migration, and the continuing scolding and chiding from the left towards anyone who dare say this is a problem, this is, as I say, if you couldn't come up with a better recipe for social discord if you tried. And that's what we've ended up with.
Madness, Tom. Completely agree with you. Been great to have you on.
Sorry, it's such a bleak ending, but
yeah,
it's all going to be fine in the end.
Fantastic. Well,
I am quite optimistic.
If you enjoyed that,
enjoy is the wrong word. But
hit subscribe. Don't forget subscribe, like, share, the hype button, Tom.
I want to ask you about the hype button. I hadn't even come across
Spiked
the hype
online.
button.
I haven't found the hype button. I'm not going to show you where it is. But basically,
that sounds more suggestive.
Basically, helps us get up the feed. More people hear what Tom has to say, as they should. Thanks again for watching. Really appreciate you guys. Thanks. Bye-bye for now.
Right, a quick pause in the podcast to tell you about our sponsor, Incogni. You had those phone calls from numbers you don't recognise, or you go in your inbox and there's emails for stuff you did not sign up for. Well, that's because someone somewhere is selling your private information. That's where today's sponsor comes in. Incogni. They will contact these people who have been taking your information, and they'll say, "Oi, stop. delete it. Go to the website, incognito.com. You type in the details. 2 minutes later, Incognito is sorting it out for you automatically. And because I love you, I've got you a discount. It ain't 10%, it ain't 20, 60% off. 60% off an annual Incognito plan. Just go to incognito.com/daily expresso or click the link in the episode description box below.